whatever you thought you knew about Abraham, just forget it. Seriously. Wipe the slate clean.
Yeah, completely clean.
Because if you grew up in Sunday school, or even if you've just read the history of Jewish tradition, you have this picture of Abraham as the ultimate hero of the faith.
Oh, absolutely. The Titan of the Old Testament.
Right. The guy who figured out monotheism while everyone else was worshiping the moon or whatever. The model of virtue. The giant who got it right when everyone else got it wrong.
That is the traditional view, yeah. I mean, if you look at Second Temple Judaism, the literature surrounding the time of Paul, like the Book of Jubilees or the Wisdom of Sirach Abraham, is often portrayed as the one who obeyed the Torah before it was even written.
Like you just intuitively knew it.
Exactly. He is the rock. He is the absolute standard of piety. The logic for first century readers was simply that God chose Abraham specifically because Abraham was righteous.
Right, the rock, the first monotheist. But then, and this is where we're starting our deep dive today, we open Romans chapter 4. We get to verse 5, and Paul drops a phrase that must have felt like an absolute slap in the face to his readers.
A total shock to the system.
He doesn't call Abraham virtuous. He doesn't call him the first monotheist. He uses the Greek phrase, ton aseba.
The ungodly.
The ungodly. That's a scandal. It's almost rude. Help us unpack the shock value here, because we are talking about the patriarch of the faith, the father of the nation, and Paul is essentially calling him a pagan sinner.
It is shocking, and it's meant to be visceral. You have to realize that for Paul's audience, ungodly aseba wasn't just a generic everyday term for a sinner. It was a highly charged sociological label.
Like a slur, almost.
Very much so. It was the term often reserved specifically for the Gentiles. The people entirely outside the covenant, the people who didn't know how to act, who worshipped idols, who had no moral compass whatsoever. And here's Paul taking that exact label and slapping it right onto the father of the Jewish people. But the tension here goes way deeper than just a historical insult. It's a massive theological crisis.
How so? Why is it a crisis rather than just, provocative name-calling?
Well, because the text says God justifies the ungodly. Now, you have to look at the Old Testament background here to see the problem. The Hebrew Bible is abundantly clear about the definition of a just judge. In Exodus 23:7, God specifically says, I will not acquit the wicked.
Right.
Or look at Proverbs 17:15. It says, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike an abomination to the Lord.
So by the very standard of the law, justifying a wicked person is an abomination.
Exactly. A good judge condemns the wicked and justifies the righteous. That's just how justice works. If a human judge let a guilty criminal, say a murderer or a fraudster, go free, and not only let them go, but declared them righteous and law-abiding, we'd call that judge completely corrupt. We'd say the justice system is broken.
We'd be out organizing protests outside the courthouse.
Precisely. But Paul is saying that God, the ultimate judge of the universe, looks at the esubri, the ungodly, the rebellious, and declares them righteous while they are still ungodly. This creates a massive, glaring theological tension. How can God be just if he does the very thing he explicitly forbids human judges to do?
That's the million-dollar question.
And this is where Beverly Roberts Gaventa, one of the commentators we're really leaning on for this deep dive, provides a crucial insight right out of the gate. She says this isn't just about a legal standing. This is and I love this phrase, the rectification of the enemy.
The rectification of the enemy, that is heavy.
Yes. God isn't dealing with a neutral party here, or even a slightly flawed but generally good person. He is dealing with the actively rebellious. It's an intrusion of grace into a hostile territory. It's God crossing the battle lines to save the opposition.
That is a massive shift in perspective. It means the starting line isn't, try hard and God will top you up with grace. The starting line is you're actively hostile and God justifies you anyway.
Correct. And that reality sets the stage for everything else we're going to discuss today. If you don't grasp the utter scandal of the esopy in verse 5, you just don't get Romans 4.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second before we get into the nitty-gritty of the verses themselves. We need to orient ourselves within the larger book of Romans. We just came off Romans 3, specifically that dense, incredibly heavy section at the end, 3.21 to 31.
Courtroom drama.
Exactly. That was this intense scene where Paul basically indicts the entire human race. He drops the gavel and says everyone is guilty, every mouth is stopped, there's absolutely no defense. But then he reveals that God has provided a righteousness apart from the law. So given that bombshell, why do we even need chapter 4? Why does Paul suddenly switch gears to a biography of Abraham? Is this just a sermon illustration? Like, here's a nice story from the past to help you understand my hard theology?
It is definitely not just an illustration. It's the evidence. It's the binding legal precedent. Think of it this way. In chapter 3, Paul made a radical, truly revolutionary claim. He claimed that justification is by faith alone and is completely available to all nations, Jew and Gentile alike. That was a massive, controversial thesis statement. Now, in chapter 4, he has to prove it.
Right, because otherwise they'll just dismiss him.
Exactly. He has to prove it straight from the scriptures, or his Jewish audience will just write him off as a heretic who's teaching some dangerous novelty.
So he's calling his star witness to the stand.
Yes, and the star witness is Abraham. Thomas Schreiner, another one of our key commentators today, argues that this chapter is the biblical proof of the thesis in chapter 3. If Paul can show that Abraham, the very beginning of the Jewish story, the absolute fountainhead of the covenant, was justified by faith alone, then his gospel isn't a novelty at all.
It's the original plan.
It's the original plan. It's not Paul inventing a new religion. It's Paul uncovering the true original roots of the old one.
So if Abraham was justified by works, Paul's whole theology completely collapses.
Completely. If Abraham earned his status, then grace is basically just plan B for people who aren't quite as good as Abraham. Paul has to prove that grace was always plan A.
Right. And Douglas Moo, our third voice today, puts it in a really similar way. He describes this whole section as a dialogue with Judaism. Paul isn't just monologuing into the void. He's actively engaging with the prevailing theological thoughts of his day. He's trying to show the law and the prophets actually witness to this gospel. He's rewriting the biography of the forefather to show that the Gentiles were always meant to be part of the family.
Well, rewriting is a strong word, but it's accurate in terms of shifting their perspective. He's reading the established story through the definitive lens of Christ and showing them things in the actual text of Genesis that they had conveniently glossed over or totally misinterpreted for centuries. He's moving us from the strict courtroom of chapter 3 into the messy family history of chapter 4.
And instead of finding a pure pedigree of rule followers, we find a story of faith and dead bodies coming to life.
Which is a brilliant image.
Dead bodies coming to life. We're going to get to that resurrection theme later, and it is incredibly potent. But before we dive into the text verse by verse, we really need to properly introduce our guides for this deep dive. As you've mentioned, we have 3 heavy-hitter commentaries on the table today. Thomas Schreiner, Douglas Moo, and Beverly Roberts Gaventa. And they do not always see eye to eye.
No, they certainly don't. They represent very different theological nuances, and seeing exactly where they clash actually helps us understand the text so much better. It prevents us from just smoothing over the difficulties of Paul's writing. Let's break down their theological DNA.
Let's start with Thomas Schreiner. He's writing for the Baker Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament. What's his baseline vibe?
Schreiner is what we might call the forensic architect. He reads the text from a staunchly reformed perspective. He is heavily focused on grammatical historical exegesis and really zeroed in on the legal courtroom metaphors: guilt, acquittal, justification as a strict legal verdict. For Schreiner, the central defining battle in Romans is works versus faith. He argues fiercely that when Paul says works, he means any human attempt to earn merit before God. And because of that, he is very polemical against what modern scholars call the new perspective on Paul.
Let's pause on that term for a second, because if you're listening to this and you've read any modern theology, you hear the new perspective brought up constantly. It frames a massive amount of the debate in Romans 4. What exactly is that, briefly?
Right. Briefly, the new perspective championed by scholars like E.P. Sanders, James Dunn, and N.T. Wright argues that first-century Jews weren't actually legalists who were trying to earn their way into heaven by doing good deeds.
They already knew they were the chosen people.
Exactly. They believed they were saved by grace through the covenant. So the new perspective argues that when Paul writes against works, he's not arguing against the human tendency of trying to be a good person to earn God's love. He's specifically arguing against Jewish nationalism. He's talking about things like circumcision, Sabbath observance, and food laws. These were essentially badges of identity or boundary markers that were being used to keep the Gentiles out of the church.
Okay, so the new perspective says Paul isn't fighting universal human legalism. He's fighting first-century ethnocentrism. And Schreiner hates that idea.
He pushes back incredibly hard. Schreiner says absolutely no way. He believes Paul is attacking the fundamental universal human desire to earn God's favor through our own performance. He thinks if you reduce the concept of works to just these national boundary badges, you completely miss the depth of human sinfulness.
Because we all try to justify ourselves.
Yes, we all try to buy God off. We all try to boast in our achievements. So Schreiner is the staunch defender of the old perspective, seeing justification as an individual, forensic reality dealing with human merit.
Got it. So Schreiner is the architect of the legal defense against human merit. Then we have Douglas Moo, writing the New International Commentary on the New Testament.
Moo is our salvation historical synthesizer. He also comes from a strong Reformed heritage, but his focus is heavily on the timeline, the grand history of salvation. He frames everything in this chapter as a direct dialogue with Second Temple Judaism. He's the bridge builder of our three scholars. He really tries to balance the old perspective that it's about human merit with the new perspective, that it's about Jew and Gentile relations.
So he sees both happening at the same time.
Exactly. He's very careful, very balanced in his exegesis. He frequently lands on, it's not an either-or scenario, it's both and.
And finally, we have Beverly Roberts Gaventa. Her commentary is in the New Testament Library series. And I have to say, reading her alongside Schreiner and Moo, her take is usually the one that makes my brain explode just a little bit. She feels structurally different.
That's because she is the apocalyptic theologian. Gaventa isn't really interested in the courtroom metaphors or the legal standing that Schreiner obsesses over. She is entirely obsessed with cosmic power. For her, Romans 4 isn't just a manual on how an individual sinner gets off the hook legally. It's about God's overwhelming power to bring life out of death. She even translates the core Greek word dikaio not as justify, but as rectify.
Rectified, like fixing something that's deeply broken.
Like fixing the entire cosmos. For her, this whole chapter is about God actively invading a broken world that has been captured by the cosmic powers of sin and death and violently setting it right. It's way less about a legal transaction and much more about a cosmic power struggle between life and death. She brings a sheer dynamism to the text that is really, really exciting to read.
Okay, so we have the architect in Schreiner, the synthesizer in Moo, and the apocalyptic powerhouse in Gaventa. Let's take these three lenses and turn them directly onto the text itself. We're starting with the first section, Romans 4, verses 1 through 8. And the big interpretive question here is simply, what did Abraham find?
Or to put it more specifically based on the Greek text, did he find that he had grounds to boast?
Right. Did he get to say, okay, God, look at my impressive resume. I'm a pretty solid investment. I left my home country. I offered the right sacrifices. I'm a generally upstanding guy.
And the minimum consensus among all our scholars, Schreiner, Moo, and Gaventa all agree on this, is that Paul denies this flat out. Abraham has absolutely zero grounds to boast pros theon before God.
He might look amazing compared to his pagan neighbors.
Sure, compared to us, but before God, nothing. But here is where the divergence starts to creep in. What exactly does Paul mean by works in this specific section? This is where that Schreiner versus new perspective fight really heats up.
Schreiner and Moo actually stand pretty much shoulder to shoulder here, don't they?
They do. They argue that works, the Greek word erga, refers to any human effort whatsoever to earn salvation. They completely reject the idea that Paul is only talking about those ethnic boundary markers like circumcision in this context.
Yeah.
And Schreiner points to verse 4 as the ultimate smoking gun. It's arguably his favorite verse in the entire chapter.
Verse 4, that's the one about the worker and the wage. Let me quote it. Now to the one who works, his wage is not counted as a gift, but as his due.
Exactly. Schreiner says, just look at the raw logic of what Paul is doing here. It's an economic metaphor. It's marketplace language. If you work a job at the end of the week, your paycheck is a debt. The Greek word is ophilema. Your boss literally owes you that money. He's not handing it to you because he likes your face or because he's feeling generous. He's giving it to you because you earned it through your labor. It's emphatically not a gift, not charis.
Right. If my boss called me into his office, handed me a bi-weekly paycheck and said, here's a gift I'm graciously bestowing upon you out of the kindness of my heart, I'd say, no, I worked 40 hours for that. You owe me this. This is a legally binding transaction.
Exactly. That is the natural human reaction to work and reward. And Schreiner argues that if justification were based on works, any kind of works, moral or ceremonial, then God would be in debt to human beings. God would legally owe us salvation. And for Paul, the very idea that the Creator owes the creature anything is theological insanity. It's a literal impossibility.
It totally reverses the creator-creature distinction. It puts humanity in the driver's seat.
Yes. If you can put God in your debt through your performance, you are no longer dealing with the sovereign God of the Bible. You are dealing with the cosmic employer, and you are effectively his equal. Schreiner says this definitively proves that works cannot just mean being Jewish. It has to mean universal human merit. It has to mean earning. Because the contrast Paul is drawing isn't Jewish identity versus Gentile identity. The contrast is debt versus gift.
That is a devastatingly clear argument. It's really hard to wiggle out of that strict economic logic in verse 4. But Gaventa takes this a step further, doesn't she? She isn't just looking at the economics. She looks at verse 5, that shocker we started with, justifying the ungodly.
She does. While Schreiner is heavily focused on the legal impossibility of earning salvation, Gaventa pushes deep into the actual character of God. She notes that Abraham was an active idolater. She references Joshua 24.2 to prove this. That verse in Joshua explicitly says that Abraham and his father Terah served other gods beyond the river. So before God called him out of Ur, Abraham wasn't some proto-monotheist seeking the truth. He was a practicing pagan.
So the raw material God started with was literal idolatry.
Exactly. But Gaventa says the main point isn't just that Abraham used to be a bad guy. The theological point is that God's very character is to interact with the godless. It's an intrusion of grace. It's not a response to Abraham's potential piety. It's God creating a relationship out of nothing where none should exist.
It's almost like God prefers to work with the ungodly, or at least that's where his glory shines the brightest.
It's certainly where his power is most visible. If he justifies a really good moral person, that's just appropriate. It makes sense. It's boring, frankly. But if he justifies the ungodly, that's a staggering miracle. That is an undeniable display of divine power.
And then, just in case the example of Abraham wasn't enough evidence for his audience, Paul calls another massive witness to the stand, King David. In verses 6 through 8, he quotes Psalm 32, "Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven." Why bring David into this? Abraham was already the ultimate trump card.
This is a brilliant rhetorical move by Paul, and Moo really points out why it matters. This quotation creates a huge problem for anyone who thinks Paul's just talking about Jewish boundary markers. Notice that Paul links crediting righteousness directly with forgiving sin, and Schreiner hammers this point home relentlessly. What were David's works in this specific context of Psalm 32?
Well, let's just look at David's rap sheet. We aren't talking about him forgetting to wash his hands before dinner or eating something non-kosher. We are talking about premeditated adultery with Bathsheba. We are talking about arranging the murder of her husband Uriah to cover up the pregnancy. Deception. Lying.
Exactly. David wasn't losing sleep over whether he had been properly circumcised. He was the reigning king of Israel. He had the ethnic boundary markers down pat. He was a murderer and an adulterer. His works were catastrophic moral failures. So when David speaks of the profound blessedness of the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works, he's talking about moral performance. He's talking about deep, dark sin.
So Schreiner uses David as the ultimate proof that works. Means trying to be a good person and completely failing.
Right. David is the definitive proof that works fail. Abraham is the proof that works were never the baseline requirement to begin with. David shows us the desperate need for forgiveness. Abraham shows us the fundamental nature of faith.
That brings us seamlessly to the next section, verses 9 through 12. And this is all about timing, the chronological argument. It really feels like Paul just pulls out a calendar here to settle a debate.
It's one of Paul's cleverest exegetical moves. It's simple, it's factual, and the logic is undeniable. The core interpretive question on the table here is this incredible blessing of faith only for the circumcised, the Jews, or is it also for the uncircumcised, the Gentiles?
And the answer basically lies in checking the historical dates.
Yes, and Moo emphasizes this timeline heavily in his commentary. He says, look at Genesis 15.6. That's the famous verse Paul has been quoting. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now look further ahead to Genesis 17. That's where the actual covenant of circumcision is established. How much time passed between those two chapters in Abraham's life?
Well, Ishmael was born in Genesis 16, and there's a lot of waiting around, so it has to be at least 13 or 14 years, right?
Yeah, precisely. So Moo argues the logic Paul uses is inescapable. If Abraham was definitively declared righteous by God in Genesis 15, but didn't actually get circumcised until Genesis 17, then righteousness absolutely cannot depend on circumcision. It's temporally impossible. He was already completely righteous in God's eyes for over a decade before the physical boundary marker was ever applied to his body.
It's such simple, devastating logic. You literally can't argue with the timeline. It proves that circumcision isn't the cause of righteousness.
Yeah.
But then it begs a pretty huge question. What is circumcision actually for then? If it doesn't make you righteous, is it useless? Is it just, ancient cosmetic surgery?
That's the natural objection, and Schreiner jumps in here with a crucial theological distinction. He calls it the distinction between a sign and a seal. The Greek text calls circumcision a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised.
Okay, help us visualize that. A sign and a seal.
Think of a university diploma. Does physically hanging that piece of paper on your wall make you educated?
No, doing the years of classes, reading the books, and passing the final exams makes me educated. The diploma just proves to everyone else that I did it.
Right. The diploma is the public sign that you did the work. Or, actually, a better analogy might be a wedding ring. Putting a gold band on your finger doesn't make you married. The vows you say make you married. The legally binding contract makes you married. The ring is merely the sign and seal of the profound commitment that has already taken place. It publicly validates the reality to the rest of the world, but it doesn't create the reality itself.
So Abraham's circumcision was his wedding ring. It showed the world he was in a covenant, but it didn't create the covenant status. The faith did that.
Exactly. It sealed the deal that was already made internally by faith. And this leads to Gaventa's insight on this section, which is absolutely fascinating. She talks about Abraham as a prototype.
A prototype.
Yes. She highlights that Abraham isn't just the father of the Jews. Because he was officially justified while he was still uncircumcised, he is actually the father of the uncircumcised, the Gentiles first.
Whoa. I honestly never thought about the order like that. So in a strange way, he was effectively a Gentile when he was saved.
In terms of his ritual physical status, yes, he was one of them. Gaventa says this makes him the prototype for both distinct groups. He bridges the massive gap. He is the father of the uncircumcised believer because he was one, and he is the father of the circumcised believer because he eventually became one. He is the single human bridge between the two fractured humanities.
But there is a serious catch for the Jewish believer here, isn't there? In verse 12, the Greek phrasing gets really awkward. Paul talks about those who not only are circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had.
Walk in the footsteps. It's a very specific active image. Schreiner points out that the grammar here implies that for the Jewish people, the circumcised, it's not enough to just have the physical surgery. They must also actively walk in the footsteps of faith. Ethnicity alone is not enough to save you. You have to trace the exact same path of faith that Abraham walked when he was still an uncircumcised pagan.
It's completely dismantling the idea of an automatic genetic inheritance. Just because your great-great-grandfather is Abraham doesn't mean you're automatically in the family of God. You have to act like him. You have to believe like him.
Exactly. It's an active following, not a passive genetic trait. You can't just ride on your ancestors' coattails. You have to walk the path of faith yourself.
Which perfectly leads us to the promise itself. We're looking at verses 13 through 16 now. And Paul broadens the scope here in a way that is frankly mind-boggling. He says the ultimate promise to Abraham was that he would be heir of the world.
Heir of the cosmos.
The cosmos. Now, wait a minute. I remember reading Genesis. God promised Abraham a very specific piece of land, Canaan, a literal strip of real estate in the Middle East with defined borders, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. When exactly did that geographical promise become the world?
This is where Gaventa's apocalyptic lens really shines brilliantly. She says this transition is massive. Paul explodes the ancient geography. The promise isn't just about a tiny plot of land anymore. It's about the entire created order.
Why this shift, though? Why does Paul go global or really universal with this promise?
Because for Paul, the fundamental problem isn't just bad human behavior or displaced people needing a homeland. The problem is that the cosmic powers of sin and death have violently captured the entire world. The whole creation is groaning under this weight, as he'll spell out later in Romans 8. So the solution, the ultimate promise, must be God reclaiming the entire cosmos from those hostile powers. It's not just about saving individual souls so they can float away to heaven when they die. It's about inheriting the renewed universe. God is taking back his physical creation.
That is so much bigger than just, I get to go to heaven when I die. It's God winning back the actual physical reality of the universe.
And giving it directly to Abraham's multi-ethnic family. We are the heirs of the universe. But here's the crucial catch. How do you actually inherit the world? Do you inherit it through obeying the law?
Schreiner says absolutely not. He points straight to verse 15, which says, the law brings wrath.
Right. This is a strict logic gate that Paul sets up. If the cosmic inheritance depends on obeying the law, nobody gets the world. Why? Because the law only reveals sin, but it gives you absolutely no internal power to obey it. It's like a medical diagnostic tool that accurately tells you have a terminal illness, but doesn't offer any medicine to cure it. It actually exacerbates the problem by pointing out your constant failure. So if the promise is inextricably tied to your flawless performance under the law, the promise is entirely void. It's nullified. The Greek is katorgatai.
It's like a billionaire leaving $1 billion inheritance to their kid, but writing in the will that they only get the money if they never tell a single lie for their entire life.
They'll never see a single dime of that money.
Right. The strictness of the condition makes the promise practically impossible.
Which is exactly why Mu introduces these two heavy terms, promissory pistism versus covenantal nomism.
Okay, hold on. Promissory pistism, you can't just drop a phrase like that and keep walking. Unpack that theological jargon for us.
It sounds incredibly fancy, but the concept is actually beautiful. Pistism comes from pistos, the Greek word for faith. Nomism comes from nomos, the Greek word for law. Mu is meticulously distinguishing between two completely incompatible systems. A system based on promise and faith, which is pistism, versus a system based on covenant and law, which is nomism. He argues that the absolute guarantee of the inheritance is based entirely on God's unshakable promise and our responsive faith, not on our fragile law-keeping.
Why does that specific distinction matter so much for the person listening to this right now?
Because of the single word guaranteed in verse 16, the Greek word there is BECNT, which means firm, secure, utterly reliable. Mu says if the inheritance depended on our daily moral performance, no one Jew or Gentile would ever be secure. We'd all be anxious all the time, constantly wondering if we'd done enough to qualify.
Did I pray enough today? Did I sin too much this week? Is my name erased from the will?
Exactly. It produces endless neurosis.
Yeah.
But because it rests entirely on grace, it is secure. It is truly guaranteed.
It takes the crippling anxiety out of the equation entirely.
It does. It creates a secure, unshakable footing for a massive multi-ethnic family. Think about it. If it was based on the law, the Gentiles are automatically out because they don't have the law, and the Jews are constantly anxious about breaking it. But if it's based on grace, everyone is invited in, and everyone is safe once they're there.
That is a beautiful summary. And that leads us to the final major section of the chapter, verses 17 to 25. And this is where we finally get to the core of what this faith actually looks like in practice. We've talked a lot about what it is and it isn't works. Now we see what it is. It's resurrection faith.
This is hands down my favorite part of the chapter. Paul rigorously defines the specific content of Abraham's faith, and he does it by looking directly at the attributes of God. Who exactly is the God that Abraham believed in?
Paul highlights two specific things. God calls into existence things that do not exist, and God gives life to the dead.
Creatio ex nihilo and resurrection. Creation out of absolutely nothing and life out of sheer death.
Gaventa points out that this is all fundamentally about power, right?
Yes, raw divine power. She insists we look unblinkingly at the stark physical reality of Abraham's situation. Think about it. He is about 100 years old. Paul explicitly says his body was dead. The Greek is nenekromenon in terms of reproductive power. And Sarah's womb was also dead.
Double dead.
Double dead. There was zero biological possibility of life. The factory was permanently shut down. So when God says, you will have a son, Abraham isn't just trusting God to be a nice guy or generally helpful. He is actively trusting God to generate life where there is absolute, undeniable nothingness.
He's trusting in a literal resurrection before resurrection was even a formulated theological concept in Judaism.
Exactly. Gaventa says real faith is trusting God to generate life where there is zero human possibility. It is an act of sheer defiance against the established facts of death. Abraham looked at his own aged body and said, dead. He looked at Sarah and said, dead. And then he looked at the God of creation and said, life.
And Mu connects this brilliantly back to verse 5. Remember the ungodly from the beginning.
The ASB.
Right, the ungodly aspio was also a complete dead end.
Yes. Mu says, look at the profound theological parallel Paul is drawing. Just as God creates physical life from a dead, barren womb, he creates righteousness in a completely dead sinner. The ungodly person is spiritually dead. They have absolutely no life or merit to offer God, no works, nothing. They are a moral vacuum, and God speaks righteousness into them the exact same way he spoke Isaac into Sarah's dead womb.
That is profound. So justification isn't just a cold legal verdict handed down from a bench. It's a dynamic resurrection event.
It is a fundamentally creative act. It calls the righteous person into existence out of the void of the ungodly person. It's God saying, let there be light in the total darkness of the human heart. It is the exact same power that created the galaxies from nothing.
And then Bringing it all home, Paul pivots directly to us. In verses 23 through 25, he makes it clear that this whole story wasn't just written down for Abraham's sake. It was written for us.
Schreiner really emphasizes the theological continuity here. We believe in the exact same God. But our faith has a very specific historical content now. Abraham looked forward to a somewhat vague future promise of life. We look back at a concrete, specific historical event. We believe in the God who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead.
And Gaventa zooms in tightly on verse 25, which says, "He was handed over for our trespasses and raised for our justification."
She loves that specific phrase, handed over. The Greek is perdothi. It's direct echo of Isaiah 53 language, the suffering servant. Jesus was willingly handed over to the hostile cosmic powers of death so that we could be rectified. And his physical resurrection is the irrefutable proof that the massive debt is paid and the new creation has officially begun.
Okay, we've walked through the entire text. We've seen the architect, the historian, and the apocalyptic theologian at work. Now it's time for the commentary showdown. Let's pit them against each other.
Let's do it.
The core topic of disagreement is the definitive meaning of works of the law. We touched on this early on, but let's really synthesize it. Who wins the debate?
Well, let's recap their final positions. Schreiner takes the hard reformed line. Works are anything you do, morally or ritually, to try to earn God's favor. He fights the modern academic trend that limits this to just being Jewish. He argues Paul is dealing with the fundamental, universal human desire to boast in our own performance.
And Moo, where does he finally land?
Moo agrees with Schreiner theologically. He firmly believes works are ultimately about merit, but he is far more pastoral and dialogical about it in his commentary. He sees Paul actively correcting a specific first-century Jewish assumption that covenant status plus Torah obedience equals eternal safety. He's much less combative than Schreiner and far more interested in the historical conversation. He genuinely wants to save the new perspective's valuable insight about Gentile inclusion without losing the old perspective's vital insight about universal human sin.
And Gaventa.
Gaventa sidesteps the entire merit versus boundary fight entirely. She thinks it's the wrong question. She focuses on agency. For her, the core contrast isn't legal earning versus gift as much as it is cosmological. It's human impotence versus divine power. Works are fragile humans trying to construct a reality on their own limited strength. Faith is willingly participating in God's overwhelming apocalyptic intrusion.
So Schreiner says you can't earn it. Gaventa says you can't create it.
That's a really brilliant way to put it. Schreiner meticulously attacks human pride. Gaventa ruthlessly exposes human powerlessness.
So who wins? If you had to pick just one commentary to take to a desert island to understand Romans 4, whose are you taking?
That is a really tough call. But I think I'm giving the overall win to Gaventa on the heir of the world insight. The way she opens up the cosmic scope of the promise completely changes how you read the whole chapter, and really, the whole book. It stops being just a narrow theological argument about how an individual gets saved, and it becomes a massive, epic story about the future of the entire universe. It's breathtaking. It perfectly connects Romans 4 to the cosmic groaning in Romans 8.
I agree with that completely. The Cosmos insight is an absolute game changer. But I have to say, Schreiner wins on the exegesis of verse 4. That debt versus gift economic argument is just bulletproof. You cannot get around the grammatical fact that Paul views human works as a wage system that fails.
I agree. If you ignore Schreiner's sharp point on debt, you risk missing the radical offensive nature of grace. You might understand the cosmic scope, but you might miss the beating heart of the gospel, which is that God gives freely to those who absolutely do not deserve it. You really need both the forensic clarity of Schreiner and the apocalyptic grandeur of Gaventa.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all of this deep theology into one big idea. If we had to boil Romans 4 down to one single controlling sentence, what is it?
Well, we definitely need to include the ungodly. We need the creative resurrection power, and we need the multi-ethnic scope of the family.
How about this? Justification is God's creative act of bringing life out of death.
For the ungodly.
Guaranteeing a cosmic inheritance to a multi-ethnic family through faith alone.
I like it. Let's say it one more time, fully formed, so it sinks in.
Justification is God's creative act of bringing life out of death for the ungodly, guaranteeing a cosmic inheritance to a multi-ethnic family through faith alone.
That absolutely covers it. That is the gospel according to Romans 4. It's dense, but every single piece of the puzzle is right there.
So what does this actually mean for us? Let's build an application bridge to Monday morning. Because most of us aren't out here having heated debates about physical circumcision, and hopefully none of us are plotting complex murders like David. But Paul clearly thinks this is life or death stuff for the modern Christian too.
The persistent problem is that we still naturally operate on the wage system from verse 4. It's completely hardwired into our psychology. We might not be trying to meticulously keep the ancient Mosaic law, but we subtly think God owes us because of our spiritual career.
Like, God, I went to seminary, I volunteered for the church nursery for 5 years, I didn't cheat on my taxes. Surely you owe me a little blessing. Surely you owe me an easy, comfortable life.
Exactly. We view God as a divine employer. We think there is a direct, guaranteed correlation between our moral input and God's circumstantial output. And when life gets inevitably hard or when we don't feel blessed, we feel like God has maliciously stiffed us on our paycheck. We say, I did the work, where's the reward? We get bitter. We feel deeply entitled.
And the massive shift that Romans 4 demands is realizing that we are fundamentally the ungodly.
Yes. We have to violently wake up to the fact that even on our absolute best days, we are the ace baba. We are the ones without a legitimate legal claim on God. Anything and everything we receive is a sheer gift, not a wage. When you wake up in the morning, you aren't clocking in to earn God's love for the day. You are waking up as a grateful recipient of a cosmic gift you could never possibly afford. That completely changes your prayer life. You stop negotiating with God and you start thanking Him.
I think about the pastor or the ministry leader listening to this who feels utterly dead inside right now. You've been working your heart out for years, and there's no visible fruit. The attendance numbers are down. The excitement is totally gone. It feels exactly like a dead womb. The overwhelming human temptation is to just work harder, to say, if I just organize better or preach a better series or have a sharper social media strategy, I can force life to happen.
But that's works. That's trying to artificially construct reality. That's trying to manufacture an Isaac with your own failing strength. True faith is looking squarely at the dead ministry or the dead marriage or the dead dream and trusting the specific God who calls things into existence that are not. It's humbly admitting, I cannot generate life here. Only the God of resurrection can.
That is incredibly freeing, but it's also terrifying because it means we aren't the ones in control.
We never were in control. That's the entire point Paul is making. Stop trying to furiously seal your own righteousness with external human validations like impressive numbers or moral accolades or theological correctness. If you have the promise of God, you don't need the seal to prove it to Him. He already knows. He's the one who gave the promise.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive into Romans 4. It's a dense, beautiful chapter that starts with a massive scandal, the ungodly being justified, and ends with a glorious resurrection.
And it leaves every single one of us with a highly uncomfortable question.
Right. And here's a provocative thought we want you to really chew on this week. If God justifies the ungodly, what part of your own godliness are you still secretly using to try to impress Him?
Ouch. That's a good one. It requires some really honest, painful self-reflection.
Next time, we look at the breathtaking result of this faith as we move into Romans 5. Peace, hope, and the theology of the second Adam. Can one single man really break the entire world? And more importantly, can one man fix it?
We'll find out.
See you in the deep end.